Hello, writers. I'm Josiane Fortin, and today I'm interviewing Steff Green. Steff is the self-published author of over 50 books, so I'm really excited to talk to her about that. I want to know how she can be so productive. So thank you for being on the show, Steff, and please tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. So yeah, I'm Steff. I live in New Zealand. You might be able to tell by my accent. So it's very early in the morning here. I write as Steffanie Holmes. Most of my books are published under that pen name, and I write really kind of dark and moody gothic romances. I've got a few, so kind of show you. There's a couple there. So I write kind of like paranormal and contemporary romance. So I mostly fiction. And I have a couple of non-fiction books about self-publishing as well. And yeah, I'm legally blind, so I don't see any. The condition I have, I don't see any color at all. So the world is kind of 50 shades of grey
Okay.
for me, quite literally.
So you kind of see shapes in black and white.
Yeah. It's the cells in your eyes that you use to have color vision and like depth perception and to kind of see during the day, I don't have those, so I'm kind of like using my night vision all the time. So the world's quite glary and I trip down steps all the time because I can't see the depth in the world. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting condition. um yeah, I think, yeah.
That's a good description to start. And like, how long ago did you start? You look quite young to me. So how long ago did you start writing books? Do you have like 50? Do you publish like 10 a year? Like, how does that work to have 50?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm 36, and I've been writing books my whole life. And I started, it's quite a long story, but I started really seriously in university. And I worked with a publisher for about 10 years on 3 different books that they passed on. And eventually this was back when I used to write kind of like really dark science fiction. And I had a publishing deal, and then the publishing deal fell through. And I was sort of looking at having to start all over again from scratch, write something else or find another publisher for this series that I've been working on for years and years and years. And it was sort of around the time where self-publishing was kind of getting really big. So I thought, oh, I'll give this a go. So I self-published that 3 books in that series sort of between 2013 2014, and they sold terribly, but I loved it. It was so much fun. I was like, I want to do this my whole life. And then I went to a party one day, and a friend there was talking about, she just read 50 Shades of Grey, speaking of that book. And she loved it. She was so, she was like, oh, this book is awesome. And I'd read like a couple of chapters and I thought it was terrible. And so I was kind of saying that. And she was, I think, a bit sick of me, like kind of rubbishing her taste. And also she's kind of used to me being like like the sort of sweet and innocent one to a certain extent. So she's like, oh, well, you're not going to be able to write a book like that. And I thought, well, challenge accepted. So in secret, without telling anyone, I wrote this sort of like werewolf shapeshifter book, romance book, with all the sex in it. And it was about 30,000 words, and I wrote it in about 3 weeks. And I sort of found someone online who could make me a romance cover for it with a man-chest guy and a wolf in the background. And I slapped it up on Amazon, and I thought that I'd tell my friend in like 6 months and we'd have a laugh about it. But then it sold 1,000 copies in a week. And I was like, whoa, this works. So I kind of had to tell my husband that I had I'd actually made some money this month from my self-publishing, but it wasn't from my super serious science fiction books that I'd been writing for like 10 years. It was from this werewolf shapeshifter sexy romance book.
Yeah. At
And
that point, were you still in school, or you were working, or you were at
I,
home?
yeah, I was about 5 years into working. And I originally I trained as an archaeologist, but because I couldn't uh, basically I couldn't get anyone to hire me because of my eyesight. As an archaeologist or working in a museum or anything like that. So I was working, what was I doing? I was working as a Braille transcriber at the time, like kind of like transcribing books and things into Braille for blind New Zealanders. And so it was a cool job, but it didn't pay very much and wasn't what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then I'd written this book, and yeah, so I told my husband about it. When he'd finished laughing his ass off about it, he said, so you're going to write some more? And I thought, well, yes, I am. So
Of
that was
course, I
about,
would write
of
more.
course,
Like,
yeah, of
I
course
sold a
I would.
ton of them.
Yeah. So that was about mid 2015. And I basically just sort of, in my spare time, I started writing just all the time. I was just so excited about everything. So I would sort of try and write 1 to 2,000 words a day, often on the bus on the way to work, or on my lunch break, or just when I got home in the evenings. And so I started being able to publish about a book every 2 months. So I'd sort of do between 6 and 8 books a year most
Okay.
years. And it was 2018 when I quit my job, and I've been writing full time ever since. And I still do the same amount of books every year, but they're just much longer, kind of meatier books. So
Okay.
it's been
Do you
amazing.
plan a lot in advance what your story is going to be? Because like if you have to write 1,000 words a day between like your job, well, back then when you had that job, like you need to have it very clear in your mind, or it's just like pours out naturally.
I very much a pause out naturally kind of girl. But I have a system of call it outlining. Because I don't like to outline. Like if I outline a book, I won't write it because I'm like, well, I know what happens, so it's really boring. Um,
Yeah.
but what I do is I sit down, and in about sort of like 3 days, I pour out a super rough draft of the book. So it's usually about 20,000 words for a, say, 90,000 word book. And in about 3 days, I will pour that out. And that is the draft where I kind of decide. I get to know the main character. I get all the action and all the kind of story beats in the book down. It's there's no description. It's mostly just dialogue and like action scenes and like choppy sentences, and there's a lot of like insert sex scene here, notes to myself, and things like that. So I do this rough draft, and so by the end of the 3 days, I've kind of got, it's basically like an outline, except that instead of being a separate document, it's actually the bones of what becomes the book. And then
Okay.
I go over it again and turn it into like a 50 or 60,000 word draft, and then I go over it again, and then usually a fourth time, and by that time it's 90,000 words.
Okay. So you do add a lot between versions, because what happens to me is that I do the first draft and then after that it kind of dried. Like I might add maybe 10,000 more words, but I won't be able to double it like you're doing. So
Yeah, I write very rough in the beginning because my goal is not to get it perfect, it's to get words on the page, like as
yeah.
many words as possible on the page. And then I go over it again and again, and each time I go over it, I've got like a different goal in mind. Like that
Yeah.
final draft is all about kind of making it really, checking the spelling, making it really, making the characters really pop, and the kind of the themes really, or can I take this symbolism and move it throughout the book kind of thing. And that's really fun. But I'm not focusing on that in the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you study that in school, or is it like self-taught?
No, I studied archaeology and like 5 dead languages, which has been super useful in real life. No, I just read a lot, I guess. And I've done a few English papers in the past, but that's really more about kind of close reading of text. But I do read a lot, like 3 or 4 books a week. So I think, and I think after 50 books, you learn a lot just by doing it. I
Yes.
think, yeah, I think if I went back and read my earlier books, I would be mortified at the things I did that I'm like, no, that's not good.
Yeah, so
But
don't
yeah,
do that. Don't do
yeah,
that.
don't do
Don't
that.
go back. They probably still sell and make readers happy. And what advice would you give to an aspiring author, someone that's kind of amazed right now that you wrote 50 books?
Um, well, the first thing I like to always say is don't quit before the miracle, which kind of means, I'd written those 3 science fiction books plus like a bunch of other books that will never see the light of day. Way before I wrote that, I decided on a whim to write this romance book that ended up turning into my whole career. And if I had quit before, if I'd quit when the publisher rejected me after accepting, after accepting this publishing deal and then basically rescinding it, if I'd quit then I never would have had this amazing, career. And my books did, from that book, they've always done okay. And then it was book number 33 that actually like really took off. It was in the top 20 on Amazon. I was just incredible. I had so many readers. The series I wrote, from book 33, about 4 books there. And if I had never written book 32, I never would have got to 33, and I never
Right.
would have had that amazing experience of having this book series like absolutely take off.
Is it at
Um,
that point that you started to make like a full-time living from your books, or is it even before that?
I was sort of scraping by before, like I had, by the time I quit my day job, I had quite a high paying, like tech industry copywriting job. And
Okay.
between my fiction books were about sort of 60 to 70% of what I used to earn in that. And then I had a little bit of freelance work on top of that. And then when the series took off, it was about 2 years. That was the second year I was full time. When the series took off, that was like, whoa. That was like unimaginable money. But what happens when you have series like that is that you sort of think it'll go on forever, but when the series ends, a lot of those readers move on to the next thing and they don't move on to your next books. So my income dropped again, not to the level it was before, but it
Okay.
drops. So it's all like this, it's all
Okay.
wibbly wobbly. But it's amazing. And yeah, if I'd given up before I got to that book, I never would have had that. So I always look back and think, gosh, all those times I thought, God, this is too hard, and I'm never going to make it, or there's so many people out there better than me. It's the only difference between someone who succeeds and someone who hasn't is that they haven't got there yet. So
I
that
really like that. Thanks for sharing that. And what do you think was the hardest thing about becoming a self-published author? And what was the funnest thing about being a self-published author?
I think the funnest are so many fun things. The 2 things. I think in the beginning it was, an actual physical copy of it, and it looks just like all those books on your shelf that read when you were growing up. Like suddenly you sort of realize I'm a real author, like that was pretty amazing. And now the funnest thing is very much getting like fan mail from readers. um, and every week I get emails saying, this book really like helped me through a rough spot, or gosh, I really relate to this character, or oh my god, you left it on such this horrible cliffhanger, I can't wait for the next book. That's pretty amazing. And then on the flip side of that, the hardest thing is very much reviews. I try really hard not to read my bad reviews, because you might have 100 amazing reviews on a book and one terrible review, and the only thing that you will remember is every single word of that terrible review. And it can get you down a bit. And I try really hard not to read them, but sometimes you can't help it. And it's, readers, not everyone is going to like everything. And it's, it's part of the business that some people won't like your work and they will be very vocal about it.
Yes.
But it is, it is hard to read people's opinions about something that you've poured your heart and soul into.
Yes. For sure, I get that.
Yeah, and I don't think that it doesn't really get any easier. Yeah, I haven't found that has got easier over time, really. I'm just better at not looking.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you get like just bad reviews that are just like, oh, I didn't like it? Or do you get like actual criticism that you can work on, or like, oh yeah, they got a point here, like I could do this or that in the next book?
In the beginning, they were probably useful from that perspective, in that, I learned early on. So it was useful at learning what readers were looking for and kind of where I went, where I wasn't quite delivering what they were looking for. But now now it's more like you can tell that this person just wasn't right for my book. Like my book, but my book wasn't right for them. And sometimes they're horrible about it. And sometimes sometimes they're like, this author should quit now. They'll never, how dare they have written this book? It's just, and you just have to go, okay, it's fine. It wasn't for them.
Yes.
I'm not
I don't get why people would get out of their way and waste their time, like just giving really, really bad reviews. Like, what's the point? Like, if you don't like the book, it's okay. It's just move on. And
exactly. And it's a funny thing, and it's probably true in other genres as well, but particularly in romance, it's a funny thing where sometimes bad reviews will actually sell a book. So, I write sort of relatively, not super erotic, but relatively sexy books. And so sometimes people will say, they'll put a review up and it'll say, this book is just pure smut, it's just filth. And people who are looking for books that are pure smut, look at that 1-star review and they will go, that is my book, one click.
Yeah, exactly what I'm looking for. So that's perfect.
Exactly.
And how do you think your disability made it more challenging or more interesting to be an author?
It's really interesting because I trained to be in a career where I couldn't do it because of my disability. And part of that was because it turns out archaeology is actually really hard when you can't see colours, like the actual physical process of digging in dirt and looking at two different coloured types of dirt, like that's quite difficult when you can't see the difference. So part of that was realizing that that actually physically the job was difficult for me, and part of it was the discrimination of people not wanting to, sort of feeling like I was like a risky person to hire, even even for jobs that were jobs in museums that were perfectly reasonable that I could do. And writing was a really big part of me finding a career and a passion and a love that was something that no one could tell me I couldn't do. Like when I'm writing a book, and a reader is reading it, they're not seeing my disability, they're just seeing me, and that's quite special. It is so I have a few kind of adaptations for my computer that I use. So I have a giant screen, and I have the print of my Word files really large, and I kind of sit really close, so my nose is right on the screen. And I use inverted colors, so I have a black background and white writing to kind of decrease the glare on the screen. And I have a mechanical keyboard, which is really lovely to write with. But apart from that, there's not that many adaptations that I have to do, and that's nice as well. Yeah.
So that's a good career for you.
Yeah,
You
it's
talk
been
about
amazing.
like history in your books or not at all?
Oh god, all the time, all the time.
Okay.
My books are
Still a
full of.
passion of yours.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Books are full of mythology and kind of. I've always like, if I travel somewhere, I'm like, oh my god, so I always like, oh, my characters are going to travel here, and there's a lot of yeah, yes, a lot of historical references and things. It's yeah, definitely throw all that in.
Good. And what do you like most about being a self-published author rather than traditionally published?
For me, what's been really interesting is that a self-publishing success story is often a traditional publishing failure. And by that I mean because I keep so much of the percentage of the royalties, so 70% on an ebooks. Most of the books I sell are ebooks. About 70% of the cost of an ebook versus sometimes it can be sort of 10% or 8% net of a book from a publisher. Because I keep so many percentage of the royalties, I have to sell fewer copies of a book in order to make a decent income for myself. So my most successful book, which netted that one single book, the first book of the series, netted well over $100,000, and it's only sold 30-ish thousand copies. So it's not like, to a publisher that's like numbers. That's like, that's okay. And some of my least, some of my books that haven't sold as well, they might sell 3,000 copies, which is basically a failure for a trad pub book. But for me, that's 10 grand.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's been really interesting, and that means that I could write books that aren't like, a little like left of center. They aren't like completely mainstream.
Yeah.
Um, and I have a lot of heroines that have disabilities and things like that. Like, I can kind of find my little tribe of people, and they don't have to be this big, this kind of big super mainstream kind of audience. There can be a little bit, there can be people like me, or a little bit left of center. So that's one of the things I really love about self pub.
Yeah, self-publishing helps us bring diversity into the market, whereas like with the characters or the type of stories that we can tell. So that's what I like too about self-publishing. And can you tell us, how do you promote your books? What would be like the top thing that you did that really sold a lot of books?
Or have a newsletter. Oh, I love my newsletter so much. So in the back of my books, when I finish a book, especially a romance, I will write like a little bonus scene, like an epilogue, or I'll take a scene from the book that was in the heroine's point of view and write it in the hero's point of view. And then I give that away to my readers if they join my newsletter. And they love it. And they join the newsletter. I send out my newsletter once a week, which is a lot to send out a newsletter. And it's jam-packed full of teasers for upcoming books, new releases. When I've got audiobooks coming out, I do a lot of sort of, because I write these kind of slightly spooky, quite gothy books, and they've got a lot of historical stuff in them. So I'll often pick something from the book and then kind of write the real history of it. So like if I based a book off of a real haunting story, I'll tell people about the haunting, or kind of like a historical detail about something. So I do that, and I kind of, and I get a lot of replies to my newsletter, and it's very active. And so I know if I send out a newsletter and I tell people, this is a new release, then I'm going to get so many people are gonna go and buy that, and that's amazing. So and I own that. It's not like social media where if the algorithms change, I can lose all those people.
Yeah.
So that for me has been the most powerful tool.
That's really smart, the way you have a freebie like with each book. So I would think that would be very successful, and then like you have the reader hooked for the next book, and that's really smart for you to do. I don't have a newsletter yet. I need to get on to that. What writing project are you currently working on?
So I'm working on the second book in the series, and the first book in the series is releasing in about 8 days. And it's a romantic suspense. It's contemporary, so there's no like vampires or anything in it. But it's uh, 19-year-old girl. She's American. She goes to kind of a fancy sort of Oxford style college in England, and that I made up. And she lots of things happen. She finds her roommate. She finds her roommate's body buried in the woods, and so she's trying to solve the murder. She kind of loves true crime, so she's trying to solve the murder of how her roommate was killed and buried in the woods. She falls in love with a teacher. She falls in love with a kind of sort of rich, snooty guy who's arrogant guy who lives at the college. And she's trying to solve this murder, and she's getting, there's a secret society, and it's got all these kind of wonderful sort of dark academia vibes. So I wrote the first book, and I'm working on the second book, and it's really, really fun.
Okay, good. How many books are going to be in that series?
It's kind of interesting. So the second book will finish this girl's story, Georgina's story, but I'm waiting to see how it does. And if it does really well, I may extend the series with another character. So George's, close friend from school, I may make her a couple of books in the series, and then if they do well, I may make her a couple of other books. And if they don't do well, I'll move on to, I've got a vampire series in my head, so I'm gonna do that next. Yeah, so it's this is another thing that's quite cool about self-publishing. You can kind of change the plan depending on how things do.
Great. And if people want to know more about you, where can they connect with you?
Best thing is probably my website, which is Steffanie Holmes, SteffanieHolmes.com. And from there, you can find all of my books. You can find my newsletter that you can sign up to, and you can also find a link to go to Rage Against the Manuscript, which is my kind of self-publishing website. It's got lots of information about how to self-publish and some like online courses and things like that. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show. I'll make sure to share those links in the show notes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.